What's up, everybody? My name is Royce Jones. I hope you are all doing well this evening. This is the Senate District 45 Candidate Forum. It's being live streamed on the One Hood Power Facebook and YouTube pages. This forum is being brought to you with support from the New Pennsylvania Project, Straight Ahead, and One Hood Power. We want to thank you all so much for joining us this evening as we host candidates for the Senate District 45 representative position. We invited all candidates to attend this forum, and we want to thank Makenzie White for showing up tonight. So let's talk a little bit about the position. The Pennsylvania Senate is the upper house of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. The Senate meets in the state capitol building in Harrisburg. Senators are elected for 4-year terms, staggered every 2 years, such as that half of the seats are contested at each election. Alongside the Pennsylvania representatives, it forms the legislative branch of the Pennsylvania state government and works alongside the governor of Pennsylvania to create laws and establish a state budget. Legislative authority and responsibilities of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives include passing bills on public policy matters, setting levels for state spending, raising and lowering taxes, and voting to uphold or override gubernatorial vetoes. So candidates tonight will have 2 minutes to answer each individual question posed to them, and then 30 seconds to respond to any comment that is directly about them. At the end, the candidates will also have some time to answer questions from the public. Each question posed to the candidates by the audience should be a maximum of 30 seconds because of time and capacity. And we ask all of the candidates and the viewers watching tonight to engage in good faith and respect each other. Before we start, let's go ahead and hear a word from our sponsor.
When you go into an elected official's office and you ask them to fix a pothole or put a stoplight where it needs to be, they're going to go and look at your voter file and find out if you're someone who's actually casting your ballot consistently. We have elected officials in Harrisburg who are trying to take our rights to vote away and put unnecessary barriers in front of them. There's people that are working 2 and 3 jobs, and they just don't have time to go to the polls on a Tuesday in November when it's cold, and they don't have childcare or they don't have transportation to the polls. We need to make sure that access to the ballot is easier, not harder. This is the time to take action. It's going to take all of us.
Register to vote and encourage others to do the same. Visit thenewpaproject.org to learn more and join our fight.
If everyone exercises their right to vote, their voices will be heard, not only in the halls of Harrisburg, but in the halls of Congress in DC. The New Pennsylvania Project believes in low propensity voters' ability to become super voters.
All right, and we thank New Pennsylvania Project for those words. Let's go ahead and welcome tonight's guest. We would like to introduce to you Makenzie White. Makenzie White attended Franciscan University and then later attended graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh for social work and public health. She's worked in the nonprofit space as a compliance coordinator alongside adults with intellectual and physical disabilities. She served as program director in a mental health residency facility, prioritizing a housing first harm reduction model. She's also the founder and executive director of Public Health Partners, where she works with local organizations and national groups focused on transitioning to a greener economy that centers community solutions. So we will now allow the candidate to introduce herself to you this evening. And we'll go ahead and start with this icebreaker question of sorts for you, Makenzie. And what we really want to know is talk to us about why you're running for this position.
Yeah, thanks so much. And it's great to be here tonight with everyone. So yeah, I decided to run for the state Senate seat because as a social worker, I felt like I was going to work every day and seeing the problems that my clients were facing, and personally as well, my neighbors, my friends, my family, and I could see that the problems that we're all facing are so much bigger than us, and I couldn't really make the impact that I wanted. So I decided to run for this seat as an organizer who's been working in this district, I felt like we needed more leadership that is really in tune with what the issues are on the ground, and that was why I decided to run.
All right, thank you for that. So before we get into the line of questions that we have for you, just a reminder for you and everybody watching, Makenzie will have 2 minutes to respond to each individual question that she has not had time to see ahead of time. So she's hearing these questions for the first time, as are you, and will do her best to answer them. So the first question that we'll have for you tonight is really, what would be your top 3 goals, your top 3 duties, your 3 main priorities if you were to be elected?
Yeah, great question. So I think we all know that abortion rights are on the ballot this year, more than ever. So I think in Pennsylvania, we really need to make sure that we protect our reproductive rights by law, so that we don't have to worry whether our governor changes or a seat changes in the House or the Senate, that we don't have to worry about those rights, especially as we see other states enact more restrictions. We want to make sure that our fellow neighbors in other states can still come here as well for reproductive care. So I would say that would be number 1. The second is our education issues. You know, I think we knew far before the court ruling that our education system was unconstitutional and not fair, but now we have a unique opportunity to really address it. And this district, specifically in 45, we can really see the differences in the types of education that kids are given based on their zip code. And for me, that's another really big priority, is not just addressing more funding, but addressing how the funding is allocated so that it is equal for all kids. And then the last thing I would say is this district has a lot of environmental issues, especially being an environmental organizer, from the injection wells in Plum to all 3 steel plants, the Coke Works plant, the well pads, and Elizabeth. This district has a lot of environmental needs, and I really believe that our communities can have clean air and good union jobs. We don't need to pick. And we're in a unique time right now with all of the federal funding that is available for through the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and we really need to be leveraging that as a state so that we're moving towards greener solutions for our communities.
All right, so you touched on 3 topics that we will definitely be digging in deeper with this evening. We can go ahead and start first with reproductive rights. And so you mentioned that, you said that would be one of your top 3 priorities if elected. So what would you do to basically enshrine or codify reproductive rights in PA? Would you introduce legislation? What would that look like for you?
Yeah, I think it looks like introducing legislation to make sure that that is protected, and it can't just be overturned if we have a change in the House or the Senate, or the governor or anything like that, so that we all don't need to feel that fear that we feel when we felt that when Roe v. Wade was overturned. I also think it's about making sure that we aren't cutting funding to groups like Planned Parenthood. You know, as someone who's worked in the healthcare field, I'm familiar with all of the amazing services that Planned Parenthood offers. And I think it's really important that we make sure we're not cutting funding for those kind of programs. And then I would also say just making sure that our reproductive care that we're offering is also gender affirming care. I think that's another big priority that I would look to address as well.
And so, of course, a lot of that work would come with the responsibility, the duty of having to maybe reach across the aisle, right? And because certainly many of these hot button topics that we're talking about tonight, and some of the ones that you just mentioned, will require that. So, how would you work with people on the opposite side of the aisle to make sure that bills like this, important bills, aren't being held up?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, this is part of the reason I decided to run, because I felt like as a social worker, this is what I do, right? Is I build relationships. I form coalitions. I work with people who maybe have different perspectives than me. And whenever I'm in those situations, I always just approach it from where do we agree first. I think a lot of times we get caught up in where we disagree, but if we start with where we do agree and then work from there, I think we get a lot more done. And I think that's what it's about. It's about forming those relationships, getting to know people, and working together. Working in the environmental space, I work with a lot of people who have different political views than my own, but I see at the end of the day, right, no one wants their kid to have asthma. People want to breathe clean air. And I think that applies to a lot of issues, right? No one wants their family member to die because of lack of reproductive access to healthcare. So I think we really have to approach it from that and build like relationships with each other.
Yeah, and so of course a lot of this is rights related, right? So what would you say the judiciary's role is in maintaining rights for people in your district?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen like right on a federal level how a lot of these issues are a result of those overturning of our rights, right, in the Supreme Court. And I think for a lot of us, it's really frustrating and overwhelming to see that, the highest level of the courts, right, isn't really keeping in mind our rights and what we all deserve. So, on a state level, I would, of course, love to see our state and our judiciary take more of a role to make sure that that's at least protected for everyone in Pennsylvania. And like I mentioned, too, the states surrounding us that are having restrictions put into place, like those people should also be considered when we're talking about making sure that there's good access to reproductive care here.
Yeah, and you mentioned gender affirming care as well. So let's talk about the youth for a second, trans youth specifically. What would your plan be to protect trans children in school? Have you thought about that? Do you have a plan for that? What would that be?
Yeah, I think this is a really big issue. I am a huge advocate for gender affirming care. I think it's, at the end of the day, it's very simple. Gender affirming care is a human right, and I don't think it should be, we shouldn't have to fight for it so much for kids. As a therapist, I work with kids that are trans and are going through transitions, and I work with adults as well, providing the service of medical letters for transition services, which the letters shouldn't exist to begin with, but I think it's important to provide those services. So my approach would really be, how do we make sure that we're, one, educating people so that we are providing gender affirming care, because I think a lot of it comes from poor education around the issues and what it means to have gender affirming care. So providing that education to healthcare providers to make sure that we're creating those safe spaces. And then I think in schools as well, we've seen this in the news a lot lately with the different kids in other states that have unfortunately lost their lives. And I think we really need to think about the safe space that we're creating in schools, how we're investing in social workers or mental health services within schools, and things like, having access to gender neutral bathrooms. I think those are simple things that we really need to start working towards so that we're creating safer environments for all of our kids.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious too. So, you talk about having, therapists, school counselors and such to help, because sometimes it can also just be about having like a safe space or someone to talk to that understands you, right? That could literally be like life or death. And so what does that look like for you? And you work in a mental health space, and so what does that look like for you in terms of like the education or knowledge that those people would have, right? Like what kind of skills, what kind of education should those counselors have when it comes to talking to youth about situations like that? Should teachers have it? Like what is your ideal world look like as it pertains to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. And we really, first, at the bare minimum, need to make sure we have school counselors or social workers in our schools, right? Like we're talking about education before, and all these issues are related, right? So as a social worker, I have seen with working with kids at different schools that some schools have better resources and have more people in those positions to help, and others don't. So I think at first we need to make sure that there is someone in all of the schools. And usually that looks like a social worker, a licensed counselor, someone who's a certified school counselor, something like that. And then I think what you were kind of mentioning as well, like we need to think about how we're training our other professionals in the school, right? Because that might just be only one person, right? We might have a social worker, but that's one person. So we need to provide better training and education to everyone, from the teachers to the janitors to the cafeteria workers, right? So that we're changing how we approach this and creating safer spaces for people. As a social worker, that's always my goal, right? When I work with clients, is just to create a safe space. And that's what we have to do in the school. And there's a lot that are put on teachers, right? The classroom sizes are often too big, and then you have kids who have different accommodations and things. So there's a lot going on already. So I think we need to think about how we give them the proper tools and education and resources so they can provide that space in their classrooms.
Yeah, let's keep it in the classroom for a minute. So, what would your plan be to help desegregate our public schools?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there's a couple of issues that come into play here. One of the first things that really comes to my mind is, this comes down to the type of education, right, that's offered in different places. It's about the zip code people live in, because all parents want their kids to have a good education, right? But some people have the ability to move to better school districts. It's the unfortunate truth. And when that happens, we are also inadvertently allowing for, I think, further segregation of different populations. So I think part of the way to address that is to address the unequal funding in our school system, and making sure that no matter what zip code a kid lives in, they have access to the same quality kind of education, so that parents don't feel like they need to move their kids to a different neighborhood to get a better schooling. So I think that's an important part. And I think it also, this connects to higher education needs and training education programs for after high school and things like that, and the opportunities that are available. Again, it's just not equal in all of the school districts. And, I heard a speaker speak once about environmental justice issues, and he said, if we really want to get more people of color into STEM fields, right, we need to go back to education at its core, because they're not given the same opportunities in fifth grade for that science project, or in ninth grade as an internship. And that all kind of compounds and impacts. So I think it's really addressing, and this district specifically, I think it's a very wide and diverse difference between different school districts.
Yeah, and what about this? What about your position on school funding and school choice? I mean, there's a big debate around that. What's your stance on that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I am a product of public education, proud, and I think, parents should obviously have a choice where to send their kids, but I think public funding should go to public education, and that's really what it needs to focus on. And I have a lot of concerns with where we're at right now. We have this unique opportunity to really address the issues with our education system, but I am really concerned that I want to make sure we're not just throwing more money at the problem, because the problem at its core is the allocation issue and how we're allocating money to different schools, and the fact that a lot of schools are focused, relying on property taxes in order to fund their schools. And that, again, it goes to the zip code, it goes to the amount of income that different families have, and it just leads to this greater disparity. So my approach would be, we need to fix the allocation issue first and foremost, because if we don't fix that, we're just going to be putting more money into the system, and the same problem is going to be happening.
Yeah, so I want to take a bit of a pivot, because you mentioned earlier in the discussion a bit about infrastructure. And so let's talk a little bit deeper about that. So how do you address infrastructure in your district while also working to navigate gentrification? Like, how do you sort of marry those two and keep the gentrification situation, sort of at bay, while also tackling some of these really important infrastructure needs?
Yeah, it's a really important thing, I think, for us to talk about, because District 45 has a lot of areas dealing with blight, and there's opportunities, to really fix up a lot of these properties, but we want to be careful that we're not displacing populations. And I think this is really where we need to bring some out of box ideas and solutions to the table to make sure that we are improving our communities and bettering our communities, but also keeping the people who've lived there their whole lives there. So for example, using tools like community benefit agreements and working with the local municipality and the developer to build in legal requirements for developers, things like 40% is going to be of the units are going to be put aside for affordable housing, things like that. I think in my experience with local governments, and this district doesn't have any of the city of Pittsburgh, so we have lots of little governments. And, you know, there's no great like training program if someone decides to run for council or if someone's on a planning commission or something within their town. So I think I would be in this office, I'd be really interested in working with the municipalities to let them know what other resources are out there, to teach them about how we can use agreements like these to protect communities and to make sure that we invest in the economic redevelopment of these areas while also still ensuring that our people aren't going to be displaced.
And of course, while addressing all of that, you also want to try to find ways to keep it environmentally sound and safe. And you obviously have a background in this arena. So I guess the question is, how do you create legislation, right, to have sort of green energy in your district? What does that work look like for you? What are you prepared to do, and how are you prepared to take all of the expertise and experience that you have to Harrisburg?
Yeah, so one of the things I do right now for work is working on how we take the money that's from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Build Back Better from the White House, and how do we leverage that and get that money back into our communities. We are in a really interesting time in which the White House has said, you know, they want 40% of these funds to go towards environmental justice communities. But as a nation, historically, we've never really been great at doing that. So how do we make it different this time? How do we make sure that these funds actually get to the communities like Clairton or Duquesne or McKeesport or Liberty Borough that are facing these huge air pollution issues, and make sure that what the money is doing is really investing in improving communities and people's day-to-day life. In terms of, you know, how this relates to housing, I think this is why we need to create programming to have developers making sure that they're using new energy efficient standards, things like that. You know, developers are in a position where that is possible for them, right? Someone who's making a repair on their roof because it's falling apart might not be able to do that, but our developers definitely can. So putting into place programs that are going to require developers and people building new buildings to make sure they're investing in green energy, so that as we try and find a way for it to be accessible to our communities, we're at least making sure our new buildings are meeting those standards.
Yeah, and in some of your work to promote green energy and resources, how closely do you work with residents in that work in your previous roles?
Yeah, so I mean, that's what I do mainly right now, is I work as an environmental organizer. So I work in communities in this district and outside on different environmental issues that they're having, whether it's from the landfill or the well pad or the new compressor station they're proposing. And I think this is why we really need leaders who are ready to push forward these green solutions, because our communities, unfortunately, have been given the burden of dealing with the current situations they're in, which is the pollution that they're experiencing, their health impacts, right? The day-to-day things on top of trying to make a living wage and all the other difficulties that we all struggle with. So they aren't necessarily, you know, able to think about the green energy initiatives that might be out there. So I really think what we need from someone in this position is someone who is going to fight in Harrisburg to make sure that we're leveraging every single penny out of that money from the federal government and bringing it back to our communities, so that we make sure that we're moving towards a greener solution. And, you know, to that end, that also looks like investing in job training programs within our communities, because we want to make sure as we move towards green energy sources, we are also able to use our own workforce for those jobs. So how do we create job training programs so that we can train our up and coming workforce to have these jobs so that we can employ our own people with strong union jobs in their communities.
Yeah, the reason I asked is because I'm curious, like, where do you think lawmakers have been going wrong for all of these years in all of this? Like, you've been on the ground, you've talked to residents who live in some of these polluted areas and neighborhoods, communities. So, like, what has been the issue from your perspective that lawmakers currently have been doing? Like, what are they missing?
I mean, I think part of it is no one can know everything, right? And we need a legislator that has diverse educational backgrounds, and we don't always see that. We don't really have social workers in our legislature or people with different backgrounds, and that was part of the reason I decided to run, because I was spending a lot of time working with legislators to educate them, and I think that's good, right? We just need leaders who are going to reach out and learn what they don't know. We don't need them to know everything, but we also do need more people, I think, at the table who can question when industry is trying to slide through a bill and no one realizes like the real meaning behind it, right? I think we saw this just recently with the move towards the hydrogen hubs. Industry was calling that clean energy, and sometimes people don't realize or don't question. I think it's the same kind of thing we saw with fracking over 10 years ago with our state, of people don't know exactly what it is and it seems okay, and legislation kind of gets pushed through, and by the time we all realize, it's unfortunately too late. So I think it's partly about just having more people in the room who have diverse backgrounds who can bring that to the table. And then I also think we just have to recognize the power of industry in our state, and especially in a lot of these communities. A lot of the communities that are most impacted, it's also where they're getting money for their volunteer fire department. It's also where they're getting random grants from the industry themselves. And it creates this really, really complex situation where communities don't want to take that money, but they also need the money because they need the new roof on their borough building, or they need to keep their volunteer fire department running. So I think all of these issues are really interrelated. And if we want to help separate that dependency a little bit on industry, we need to give our communities the resources they need to just operate.
Yeah, because that's a whole other issue in and of itself. Like you mentioned, like borough buildings needing the money to, replace their roof, or dwindling volunteer fire companies. And so how do you address that? Like, especially, I mean, like these could be two separate topics, but I guess sort of blending the two, like, I mean, those are, especially with volunteer fire companies, you see how it impacts their response times and, just resources that they may have available to them. So do you have any thoughts on that? Like, that seems like an issue that's not really going away right now, or perhaps even anytime soon. So how can you get involved in that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue because we look at different parts of this district, and right, the main way that municipalities are making their money is through taxes, right? And that varies differently based on the area, again, and the zip code and the taxes that they're charging people and what they're able to charge. And it changes based on renters versus homeowners and all of these things. And so really grants are what is needed to make up the difference. But a large issue that I think a lot of municipalities struggle with is a lot of grants are matching grants. So you might have to put up 15 to 20% of it at the beginning. And at that point, it's not really a grant because they're being required to put up a certain amount. And I also think something that's really problematic in this specific district is there's a couple of communities in here that, originally were part of the Act 47 distressed communities. And that offers up a lot of resources and things that are available to a community. But when a community moves out of that and they're no longer categorized as that, I think they're kind of just left on their own, right? It's not that different from a person who's on Medicaid and then gets off Medicaid because they're just making just slightly enough more, but they're still living paycheck by paycheck. And if one thing goes wrong, all of a sudden they can't afford anything anymore. It's the same thing with our boroughs and our communities. And because this whole district has all these little individual communities and municipalities who all have their own fire departments and police force and sometimes school system or shared school systems. I think beyond just legislation, we need a senator who can bridge those gaps and talk to the community and be like, what do you need? And help them figure those things out, because that, isn't beholden by whether or not we have the power of the Senate, right? Whether we have the majority or not. That's about just getting people resources so that our communities can be better.
And some of that, of course, is a public safety issue. So, which is a great segue into the one question that we had for you, which is, what is your plan to address public safety from a Senate standpoint?
Yeah, I think when we talk about public safety, there's a lot of different issues. I think we can talk about, just general improvements to communities. I was at a community council meeting recently in the district, and they were talking about just getting more street lighting to make it safer. So I think sometimes it just comes down to really practical things, having better sidewalks, having lighting at night. All of those kind of things seem so practical, but a lot of these places are really struggling even with the basics of that. And then I think this relates to how we interact with our mental health population, our homeless population. Having worked as a residential director in a mental health facility during COVID, I could see that we just don't have enough beds. We just don't have enough services. And, the state closed our mental health institutions, rightfully so, because we're trying to move away from institutionalization, which is commendable, but we didn't create more programming for community mental health programs at the same time. So that just puts more people on the street and without housing. And I think we really have to talk about that, because as a mental health issue, if people are struggling with mental health, they're not getting the services they need, and then they're not housed, that leads to more people being arrested because someone isn't sure about someone on the street and they call the cops. And it's just like, I think, a vicious cycle. And a lot of it could be stopped, I think, if we addressed the issue of better mental health services and more affordable housing, as well as just making sure that we're really finding a place for the homeless to go. It's not just about a shelter. It's about how do we create affordable housing. That's not just Section 8, because Section 8 is really hard to get into, and there's a lot of people who don't make it out of the lottery, and there's just not enough affordable housing. And I think this really relates to the public safety issue.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it's like, it's such an enrapturing situation to be in, because, like, you can't, if you don't have like anywhere to live, right? Like you're on the street, whatever, you literally just get wrapped up in this cycle, because that is not at all contributing in a positive way to people's mental health. Like, I literally just spoke to a woman yesterday downtown who was on the street, and I just asked her, like, how did you get here? And like, what's your story? And like, because I'm just seeing so many, more and more and more, like, it's an issue we've been talking about for a couple of years, even longer at this point, like the homeless population growing, especially downtown. And literally, like, she was kicked out of her home. She was like crashing with family. They abandoned her. She ends up back on the street. She's jumping from shelter to shelter. And it's just like, there's no solution for her, and or any of the other people in her situation. Sometimes it feels, it's like there's no long-term goal. Like, the goal can't just be to like put people in shelters and just like get them out of the way or something. Like, there needs to be like, they need help. Like, they need actual like systemic help. So how do you talked about affordable housing? Of course, that would be one of the main ways to solve that situation. So dig deeper into that. Like, how do you provide more affordable housing? Like, what would your plan be to make that happen?
Yeah, I think, it's like you're saying, it's just such a huge issue that's impacting so many people in our communities. And I think part of it is we do have in these communities a lot of abandoned lots and abandoned buildings, and a lot of them are being held by the municipality. So I think one thing would be working with them to help renovate those spaces so that they could be used for affordable housing. Because unfortunately, what happens is either the municipality sits on it because they don't want it to go to a developer because they're afraid of it being turned into something that will displace people, or it does go to a developer and then it does tend to have those ramifications. So I think we need to work with municipalities to fix those spaces so that we can use the space that already exists. I also think we need to work with our nonprofits that are already doing great services in the mental health area and help them do more, help them find more spaces for people. Because when I was a residential director down in Oakland, we had about 35 apartments, I would say, and they were full at all times, because if someone moved in and was successful, they never needed to leave. So then everyone on my wait list was essentially waiting for someone to die in order to get a spot. So we need to work with the nonprofits who are already doing the good work to get them to expand, to find them more property sites, or to work with other nonprofits who are interested in getting into this space of housing. Because the program I worked in, if you lived in those apartments, you were independent, but you essentially had a landlord who was friendly to mental health issues. So if you were having a hard time one week, or if you were not sure about what the disability letter was that you just got, you could stop by the office and just have staff there to ask. It's not a huge change, but it's just about offering that affordable housing. And we have programs that exist, but we shut down our institutions and didn't make more programming. So we really need to invest more into the mental health programming and encourage providers and educate providers that the drug-free policy to move in doesn't work. If someone doesn't have a roof over their head and doesn't have guaranteed food, it's unrealistic to expect them to be off drugs. And I see that mostly as an education issue, because people don't know a lot about harm reduction and they're wary of it. But I think we could educate more people so that our programming isn't so limited either.
Yeah, and even going back to how I told you I met that woman yesterday, like her full story was she was in jail. I don't even remember what for. She told me, I genuinely don't remember, but she was in the system, and she gets out, and that's where things really began to go like even further downhill for her, because it's like almost like the system just kind of failed her. And I'm certain that it's not unique to her or like indigenous to her story. Like I feel like there's so many other people who, if you would ask them, have probably encountered the same thing, where it's like they get out of jail, they have nowhere to go, their family is like turned their back on them, the system is failing them. So like how do you like, and genuinely asking, because I don't know, if you were to be elected to the Senate, like, would you have any role in helping nonprofits or creating some sort of legislation to like create a better transition plan for people who were incarcerated and get out, and like helping them like get recalibrated to society, and like getting them a job or like getting them a place to stay, so they don't end up like her and they don't end up back out on the street and just forgotten about?
Yeah, this is definitely something that I would want to work a lot on. I think especially in Allegheny County, this is a huge issue. The amount of people that are in our jail that either have mental health issues or end up there for small time offenses, and then it's like a vicious cycle and they keep going back because they're homeless or they're doing drugs or things like that, and they end up just back in the system. So I think we need to find ways to help people get out of that cycle. And, you know, when I was working in mental health, I had a client who had recently come out of jail, and it was during COVID, and it was early on in the COVID pandemic, and his roommate tested positive, so we needed to get him a COVID test, but it was still when you had to go to CVS to get an actual prescription, and he had no job and no phone or computer or anything like that, and no income. And I had to figure out a way to get him, and no insurance. And I had to figure out a way to get him a virtual appointment, to get a script, to get a COVID test, which I paid for because he has no income. He just came out of jail. And then even after we got him the prescription, I had to call around to CVS's to find out who would take someone biking up at the window, because he takes public transportation, and I wasn't going to put him on a bus if he had COVID. And I think, you know, I tell this story because it's just a really good example of the constant barriers that people are facing. And it shouldn't be this hard. It doesn't need to be this hard. We have jobs that we need help with, right? There's people that are hiring, and there's people that are ready to work, and we're not we're just not connecting the dots, I think, and getting people back into society, getting them into affordable housing, getting them the mental health support that they need. And I think if we really were to focus on that, a lot of these issues we would see a change in, because it's all related. It's all related.
Yeah, and two, what do you think about mass incarceration, right? In really, I guess Allegheny County specifically, and really like statewide. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's an issue? If you do, like, how do you solve that? How do you prevent this from continuing to happen and like break this cycle?
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue, especially in Allegheny County. I think obviously the Allegheny County Jail is a county issue, but regardless, as a senator, it's something I would be very involved and active with, because at the end of the day, it affects the community. And I think, a lot of this is the failing of our criminal justice system comes from a couple of things. One, I think the war on drugs, which I believe was a complete failure. And in order to fully address this, we need to work towards decriminalizing drug use. Small time offenses, we need to get rid of things like that. Legalizing of marijuana, that stuff all relates to this issue. I also think things like ending cash bail, because that just puts, I think, a penalty on poverty, honestly, and people who are stuck in the system. And then I think the other issue with our criminal justice system is it just really shows the history of the racist policies that our country has had. When we see the inordinate amount of Black and brown people that are impacted by our jails. And, it's also a mental health issue, because I can't remember the number right off the top of my head, but, 20 some people with mental health issues were killed in the Allegheny County Jail just within the last couple of years for not receiving proper medical treatment and things like that. And, that's something I saw when I worked in mental health. My residential facility, I had 3 residents at one point who came from that jail and received traumatic brain injuries from that jail, and all of them were Black men. And I just think this is a huge issue, and it's a human rights issue, honestly. I think prisoners deserve to still vote. I don't think they should be taken away from those rights. I think there's a lot of issues, and this is something that's really important to me, and I would really fight for.
Do you think that there's any gray area about like who even benefits from jail, right? Like where do you see what I'm saying? Like who is this positive for? Who's reaping benefits of even having all of these inmates? Just why?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, I think we see this issue with the privatization of jails too, right? Because in those kind of situations, who's reaping the benefits? The people who are getting the money from running these jails, right? And I think, which is why I'm against like privatization of jails, because I don't think we should be making a profit off of this. And, it comes down to the fact of like the amount of money we spend on our jail system is more than our education system, right? That says it all. That tells you where we've put our priorities and where we've put our money is it's in jail. And like I've worked with a lot of people in and out of the system, and I don't think we're really giving people the opportunity for second chances. We're not really believing that someone can make a mistake and then, choose to turn their life around. And I think we really need to shift the way we think about that. And especially when we talk about with our youth, just the amount of, I think, youth that end up in the system and then they just can't get out. It's just like a vicious cycle, and it keeps them in until they're adults. And I think we really need to address that. And part of that is these bigger issues. It's all related, right? So kids having affordable housing, them having access to a fair and equal education system, having access to after school programming, having access to places to go after school. Some parts of this district have amazing parks, and others have ones that are literally closed. And I think, addressing all of those things also impacts our youth and really their projection for them, and trying to keep them out of the criminal justice system.
Right. And so many of your answers to a lot of these questions have really been, rightfully so, because this is a Senate position, budget related problem solving. And so with that being said, and that being one of your main responsibilities in the state Senate, what would your top budget priorities be? And sort of explain to us too how you would be sort of advocating for fiscal like responsibility there amongst your peers as well, and making sure that the money, the taxpayer dollars and all of the money that is there is going to the right place.
Yeah, I think, for me, part of it is like really seeing from a human services perspective. And, this was one of the reasons why I decided to run is because I was like, after working through COVID as an essential care worker, I was like, I don't really think there's a lot of legislators who understand how to fill out a Medicaid application or how long it takes to do disability applications and get them back. And I really think we need people in the legislature at these budget meetings that can be like, this is an unreasonable amount to pay for X programming, or we should invest this much more into a harm reduction program instead and incentivize like nonprofits to be moving towards that because it's an evidence-based program. So I think part of it would be for me really looking at how we're funding into the human services. And then also on the environment space, like I'd really like to see more conversation about how the money's spent towards like things I was mentioning before, green education, green energy investments, and just also funding our Department of Environmental Protection, right? They're not fully funded by the legislator. So, I hear constantly when working with them is we just don't have a staff member to send out to look at that spill that happened at that site. And it's just an unfortunate reality. They're supposed to protect our environment, but they don't have the staffing or the funds to do it. And it's a little unrealistic. So if we're not going to fully fund them from the legislator, we need to find ways to make up for it for them because they need that money. So I think really for me, the budget issues would be looking at like how that money is going to get back to our communities and impact change the most.
Yeah, and even outside of the budget, from a consensus standpoint, how do you go about sort of given the makeup of the Senate right now, how do you go about building a consensus for legislation that impacts or benefits your district?
Yeah, I mean, this is like what I said before. I think, in the environmental space, I work with a lot of people with different political views. And I think it's about finding where we unite because I really don't believe that anyone wakes up one day and is like, I'm going to pollute the earth today. But everyone needs to put food on their table. Everyone needs to put their kid through college. Everyone needs a good job. And I think most people are just doing the best that they can. And I think when we're trying to talk about consensus and how we approach things, I think that's how we have to think about it is no one wants their kid to have asthma. Everyone wants to have a good education. I think approaching it from that place will always get more done. And then also just really advocating for those kind of relationships and also just bipartisan bills, things that, are going to be supported on both sides. One of the things I would look to do is there is a tax credit that small businesses get for making accessibility upgrades. The number is pretty low for what they get. And for most small businesses, it's not worth making those accessibility upgrades. So proposing to raise that so that small businesses can make the upgrades they need because Pittsburgh is, a historically older building area. And a lot of our buildings just aren't accessible for the disability community. So something like that, I think a lot of people can get behind, right? Like, how do we make our spaces more accessible for the disability community, for the elderly community, and make sure like small businesses aren't going bankrupt trying to do that.
And one thing that I wanted to ask you too, and we slightly touched on this one as well, but what are your plans to, like, we talked a bit about sort of affordable housing and things like that, and more green space or green energy, excuse me. But like when it comes to poverty, I mean, it's, how do you solve that, right? Like we talked about affordable housing, but I mean, like if you have nothing, right? Like if you're living in poverty, maybe you can't even afford to handle that. So like, how do you get more more money into people's hands and like get people some of these like better paying jobs or more just like how do we fix that?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, as someone who still rents, this is an issue that's important to me because I think, you know, the research keeps showing that like more and more of us are just living paycheck to paycheck. And there's a couple of things. We obviously need to increase the minimum wage immediately. And we also need to make sure that we write in that we're going to do regular increases of that, or it's going to adjust with cost of living. So that we're not in this problem in 5 years again, where it's now out of date and we haven't touched it. I think looking at programs like the child care tax incentives, we really need to figure out the child care issue. It is such a huge issue for so many people in our community. Whether people have kids, whether they're hoping to have kids in the future. I know too many people whose one of the parents' whole paycheck goes to their childcare every month. And it's just an unacceptable issue. We need to find a better way to offer childcare for our communities and for our families without it making people go bankrupt. I think access to fair and good health insurance and health care is also part of this. As someone who's lived uninsured for a while, it's incredibly stressful when you don't have health insurance and you're hoping nothing goes wrong and that you don't have to go to the doctors, or your kid doesn't get sick and now you have to take them to the doctors. And medical debt is a huge issue. And I think part of getting more money into people's hands is addressing the fact that our healthcare system is just not working for most of Pennsylvanians, I believe. And I think all of these issues are related to how much money people have in their pockets. And it's also about fighting for union jobs. You know, growing up, my mom was a teacher and my dad was in a union from the state. And I knew how both of those things impacted my family growing up. And we really need to fight for union jobs because that's what it comes down to. We just have too many workers who are underpaid and not receiving fair wages or fair rights in the workplace, and allowing groups to unionize and helping connect them to unions, especially in the healthcare space, which is really, really difficult to unionize when we have some pretty big monopolies out here in our healthcare system. And you know, there's just, having come from a healthcare space, I'm very aware of the low wages for healthcare workers, for direct care workers. And all these issues are related. Direct care workers need to be paid more, but agencies need to be reimbursed more for the services so that they can pay workers more. It's all connected. And I think this is why we need people in our legislature who understand these issues, who are really familiar with them, and also are just willing to show up in our communities and ask what people need. I don't think I'll ever know all the answers, but I don't think that's what we need from leaders. We just need leaders who are going to show up and actually ask what our community needs and not make those assumptions.
Yeah, and then too, on the topic of like raising the minimum wage, you know, I've talked to business owners, small business owners who, you know, they'll say, you know, we would love to pay our employees more and like we would love to, you know, see the minimum wage increase, but we just don't know how we can afford it. Like we're struggling, business isn't doing well. So like what are we supposed to do? We're gonna have to like fire people or like lay people off to be able to, you know, compensate for that. So how do you also address that while working to raise the minimum wage in this state?
Yeah, I think that's a serious issue. And that's why we can't make these policy decisions in a vacuum, right? And I think we've seen that happen a lot in the past in the state and just federally. Like our policymakers have made decisions and, you know, no one in the room at the time thought there was anything wrong with it. And then we all see the unintended consequences on our daily lives. And I think that's an example. We all know we need a $15 minimum wage, but we need to sit down with these small businesses and figure out how we can make that work. And, you know, I think that's also very related to the healthcare issue, because I know lots of nonprofits who aren't paying their direct care workers $15 an hour, and they would love to, but what they're reimbursed from insurance for that service is not $15 an hour. So they're in the same boat. If we don't increase those rates, they're not going to, it's like not economically viable for them to run those direct care programs. And we can't have that backfire and have programs not offering those services anymore. So I think it's really about looking at the big picture and sitting down with all of these stakeholders and figuring out like how we can work together to make sure people have a fair living wage, and our businesses are supported.
Yeah, 1000%. Another thing too, I just want to circle back real quick to the affordable housing point that we discussed. So like, all right, from based off of what we've talked about, so we have more affordable housing. We've gotten people jobs to like pay for the rent, like at said affordable housing. How do we keep that rent from then skyrocketing? How do we address rent control and like skyrocketing rent prices? It's continuing to go up. All of us renters know about it. We're living it right now, year after year after year. How do we address that? How do you address that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like I said, as a renter myself, it's an issue I'm, intimately familiar with. And I think this is why we need things like rent control. We need to not allow landlords to charge crazy amounts of rent that are just not realistic. We need to have a tenant's bill of rights, because I think we probably all know too many people who've had really terrible landlords who wouldn't meet their basic rights. I myself have been in that situation before, and we had to move out of a place. So I think we need to also educate tenants on what their rights are, because I remember when we were having issues like Googling stuff on what my rights were, because I didn't know, and texting my friend who was in law school and be like, do you know anyone who can help me with this? Because most of us don't know. We don't know what our rights are. And I think a tenant bill of rights would be really important. And this goes hand in hand with also working on the eviction issue, because, right, this goes back into the homeless issue and all of these things of making sure people aren't being evicted there's just too many stories I've heard of people being evicted over really poor reasons, or not given much time in order to pay rent or things like that. And I think we really need to be working with the housing sector in general to avoid that.
Nice. I do want to go ahead and focus our attention on the comment section. We're streaming on Facebook and YouTube right now. I want to go ahead and pull up this question from Terrence from Facebook, and it's sort of in relation to the whole environmental justice topic that we discussed earlier. And so their question is, do you have any legislation that you want to propose for what environmental justice looks like for people of color specifically? Will you support organizations of color that are committed to environmental justice?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first one first, because that's a quick answer. So yes, I will definitely support those organizations, and I would lean on those organizations because, like I said, I can't live in every community. I don't have everyone's lived experience. So I think as a leader, it's important to rely on the groups and the organizations and the people that are living in these communities and experiencing these things when we're addressing the solutions. What was the first part of the question again? Sorry, it disappeared.
So the first part of the question was, do you have any legislation that you would want to propose for what environmental justice looks like specifically for people of color?
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I've been working on through work is the Department of Environmental Protection is currently renewing their environmental justice plan. So it talks about like how we engage in environmental justice communities with permits. And I really think we need stronger legislation around this. If a community is already identified as having several facilities that are, causing air pollution, causing a lot of issues, I don't think we should be approving more permits to add to it. There's been studies that have shown that the amount of like well pads in a community or the amount of major polluters is directly correlated to redlining of our districts. And we need to recognize that, because it's not just an issue of the current pollution, but these communities are facing generational pollution, and we can't continue to allow that to happen. So I think first and foremost, it's like cutting it off. And then it's how do we address it in the communities that already exist so that we're not losing jobs, but we're also making sure communities have clean air. And, one of the issues in this district is the Clean Air Fund that gives money from the fines that Coke Works and Steel like pay when they reach those exceedances, and how that money gets back into the communities. So one of my goals too would be, even though that's a county specific thing, it's an issue that's very important to a lot of people in this district. So how do we make sure that that money is being invested in things that are actually going to improve people's lives, like upgrading the school's HVAC system, so that we're improving kids' indoor air quality, things like that.
All right. And that looks like the only question that we have in there right now. So I want to move on to our final question as the forum comes to a close this evening. We always like to end it on a positive note, Makenzie. So I will leave you with this question. What brings you joy?
Oh, that's a good question.
Right?
I think, especially because right now my life is engulfed with this campaign. So what's really been bringing me joy is spending time in the communities, just seeing how many people really want change for their community and are ready to work for the change. I think that brings me joy, and it makes me realize like we all want the same things. We all want clean air. We all want good jobs. We want a roof over our head. And we want leaders who are going to listen to us and who are going to show up and ask what we need. And seeing that level of engagement in our communities is, I think, really what is bringing me joy lately.
I have one more, sorry.
Yeah.
How do you I guess, what is your plan to sort of if elected to carry the torch right into the Senate, and kind of not be one of those people who goes to communities, or maybe they have done work in the communities, or maybe they have never worked in the community at all. They show up, it's campaign season, they pose for pictures, they meet certain people who they feel like they should be taking pictures with and shaking hands with, and they go to these communities where they think they need to position themselves for whatever particular reason to benefit their campaign. And then whenever they get elected, some of us are kind of just standing there looking like, well, where'd you go? What happened to that? What happened to this, and the third? So how do you plan to sort of not be one of those people and continue to be someone that, people in small communities or any size community can trust that you're going to handle their business on their behalf?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, it's definitely a reason why I decided to run too, because I was seeing both personally and professionally how much of our district just felt left out and left behind. Like no one was really listening to us. So to me, it's, obviously it's a campaign, but it's not about me and it's not about this campaign. It's about all of us and making our communities better. And, that's what I do as a social worker. It's not about always what I think. It's about what the community is advocating for and how we build power within the community to make that a reality for people. And I see this as an opportunity to do that for my community at a larger level. So whether it's during campaign or not, I will never stop showing up to these community meetings and community events, whether I win or not, because that's also how we change things. It's how we build these people-powered movements. It's how we change our communities for the better. It's showing up and talking to people and asking what they need, because having leaders who sit in Harrisburg and decide what we need isn't really helpful, and a lot of times isn't what we actually need. So I think it's just about continuing to show up and ask what people need, and it's not about me or what I think we need. It's really about the community.
All right. And before we bid you adieu, how can people reach out to you and contact yourself or your campaign?
Yeah, so you can find us on all major social media platforms. It's Makenzie for PA, all spelled out, not the number. Our website is also makenzieforpa.com, and that has information about how you can volunteer or get involved. We are starting our canvassing this week, so if anyone is interested in joining us, we will most likely be in a community near you at some point, and we'd love to have you out.
All right. Thank you so much, Makenzie, for joining us tonight. Before we go, I want to give you a quick reminder. Primary election day is April 23rd. Polls are open on election day from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. The last day to register to vote is April 8th, and the last day to request a mail-in or absentee ballot is April 16th. thank you all for attending tonight's candidate forum hosted by the New Pennsylvania Project, Straight Ahead, and One Hood Power. We hope you were able to learn more about the position as well as the candidates ahead of the April 23rd election. Again, my name is Royce Jones. We'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. Good night.
My name is Ethan Rabb, and I'm the Reflective Democracy Associate here at One Hood Media. I see voting as a tool for liberation because it brings us behind enemy lines. As of now, February 2024, the ACLU is already tracking almost 400 bills against LGBTQ community alone, and we need voting as a means to bring our driven constituents of our community into those positions of power to actually take back that power.
Thank you, Makenzie. You are free to exit the studio.